Our next speaker is Kirill Nourski, who's been speaking on transformation of stimulus representation along the cortical auditory pathways.
Good morning. It's great to be here. So I will continue in the same vein sort of as the previous two speakers, talking a little bit about lateralization of the brain function and the semantic categorization. I have no disclosures other than I love Australia. So to get us started, I would like to point out that auditory areas on the superior temporal plane and on the lateral convexity in the human brain represent initial stages of processing of speech in the human cortex. They represent acoustic and phonetic attributes of speech in a temporally precise manner. Now, outside canonical auditory cortex, these auditory-related areas, which are like Yugoslavia and the Eastern Bloc, participate but do not enter, they do a slightly more complex computations, and they, along with prefrontal cortex, are associated with perception and ultimately action. So my colleagues and I used intracranial electrophysiology in humans to clarify where and how stimulus-driven activity in the auditory cortex is transformed into activity that is ultimately leading to perceptually driven behavioral events. And we used an auditory semantic categorization task for that purpose. So I said intracranial electrophysiology, for those of you who are not familiar, this is unique opportunities that are afforded in the clinical setting, recording directly from the human brain in epilepsy patients who are implanted with electrodes for monitoring purposes. So these electrodes come in different flavors. Most broadly, they are either placed on the cortical surface, and that is called ECOG, or electrocorticography, or they can be implanted into the brain parenchyma, and that is called stereo EEG, or SEEG. In this particular study, we aggregated data from a total of 45 different participants, and here I'm showing you a summary of their electrode coverage. We used a pretty dumb task, to be honest with you. It was just playing words 2 seconds at a time, cat, dog, 5, 10, and so forth. And on each run of this task, the participant is instructed to press a button whenever they hear a word that belongs to a particular semantic category, like number, for example, right? So they hear 5, they press a number. They press a button. At the same time, obviously, recordings were made from their implanted electrodes. So across 45 participants, we had a little over 6,300 recording sites in different brain regions. So shown here on the left is an exemplar electrode coverage in the participants. So you see we have pretty generous coverage both of canonical auditory areas as well as dorsal and ventral auditory-related cortex, prefrontal, and so forth. And the color plots here show examples of single trial high gamma, that's 70 to 150 hertz, power recorded on a trial-by-trial basis, sort of stacked, sorted according to reaction times. So here I'm just showing you the responses to the target stimuli, right? When they heard the word, they pressed the button. And you can see that in some of these areas, so in the left column, posterior medial Herschel's gyrus, that's primary auditory cortex, lateral STG, secondary auditory cortex, you see that these responses are time-locked to the stimulus onset. In other words, they are stimulus-related. But then there are other examples shown in the right panel, and that's these higher order areas where nothing much happens immediately in the aftermath of the stimulus onset, but then response builds up and precedes the behavioral response. So we call them, they are essentially time-locked to the reaction time, we call them behavior-related. So we sought to basically find where do we see one type of response versus the other, and we did so by measuring activity averaged within 200 millisecond window after stimulus onset, and then window that's kind of slides, kind of banana-shaped here, right, because the reaction times obviously vary, preceding offset. So the sites that exhibit significant responses post-onset, but not pre-button press, we call them stimulus-related. sites that do the other thing, we call them behavior-related, okay? And then if there is a significant response in both windows, we'll call them intermediate. So this is the distribution from all 45 participants, just plotted on the left hemisphere for brevity's sake, of these two main response types. And as you can see, the stimulus-related pattern is by far more common of the two. By contrast, behavior-related activity is more sparsely represented throughout the brain, and it has the highest prevalence in the prefrontal cortex, more limited representation in anterior temporal sensory motor cortex. What's remarkable, auditory cortex, canonical auditory cortex, really doesn't do that. Also remarkable is the fact that we see a lot of purple on the left side. Purple is sensory motor cortex, right? So the stimulus-related and not the behavior-related, as one might think, is way more common in sensory motor cortex. Now let's show the same data, but in a slightly different manner. Let's separate it by hemisphere, and we'll color the stimulus-related sites blue, behavior-related sites red, intermediate green. So what we see here is that stimulus-related activity has a higher prevalence in the right hemisphere than on the left, and the opposite is true for behavior-related activity, particularly when compared on the whole brain level. And now for my final trick, we will look at the same data in a different way again, and we shall interrogate individual brain regions in terms of the balance between stimulus-related and behavior-related pattern. We'll do so only for regions where we have at least 5 sites with one type of response or the other from at least 2 participants. And we'll calculate this bias, that is the difference over the sum between the two numbers of sites that exhibit significant pattern of one type or the other, and we'll color code them from purely stimulus-related to purely behavior-related. And as you can see, certain brain regions, in particular pars triangularis of the inferior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, so both in prefrontal cortex, as well as the temporal pole, all have a bias towards behavior-related activity, and this bias is more pronounced in the left hemisphere. Notably, orbitofrontal cortex has the highest bias towards behavior-related responses across all regions that we've had a chance to look at. So, to conclude, these results show these progressive stages of cortical auditory processing where initial stimulus-driven activity ultimately is transformed into activity that is time-locked to subsequent behavior driven by that stimulus. And this transformation preferentially happens in the higher order areas of the left hemisphere, and the involvement of sensory motor cortex on the stimulus-related side emphasizes its important role in its contribution to auditory processing in the human cortex. And as far as our next steps, we would like to examine whether this stimulus-related activity in sensory motor cortex, as well as the bias that we observed towards the left hemisphere, whether that really is specific to speech processing or whether any of it can be generalized to non-speech sounds as well. So finally, I would like to acknowledge all my colleagues who have contributed to this study, and I thank you all for your attention. Cheers.
Hi, thanks for that. That seems like a really great data set you guys are putting together. I was wondering if you guys are planning to look at categorization of the speech words to see which sites are, say, discriminating between the different types of speech words, you know, whether they're animals or objects or, you know, anything like that.
We have not done that in a systematic way. I think we can do that because we aggregate data across 2 different targets. So it's numbers on one run and then animals on another run. And we have also stimuli as part of that package. We have exemplars that are consistently non-targets, so we have colors also. So we certainly could do it on multiple levels. We could basically look at sites that basically contain information that allows for separation of categories as well as individual words and maybe even like individual exemplars of these words. So different levels of processing. Thank you very much. That's a very, very good question.
Yeah, I think that would be important for understanding the information processing hierarchy, which I think you guys can get at. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's a technical question. So did you also place the electrode on the supratemporal plane inside the Sylvian fissure?
Yes. So we've been consistently at University of Iowa, we've been consistently recording from the superior temporal plane. We only use depth electrodes for that purpose. And that's part of a standard implantation strategy where one electrode usually goes along the length of Heschel's gyrus and kind of skewers it like a Heschel's gyrus kebab, if you will. And then we often have a posterior array that targets the planum temporale and then ultimately posterior insula, and then a more anterior electrode that goes into the planum polare and ends up in the anterior insula. So all this stuff, and the same goes for superior temporal sulcus. We also record a lot from both banks of the STS, and those electrodes, obviously this is not done because I said so. This is done for clinical reasons, so those electrodes would target the amygdala and the hippocampus. Thank you.
The second question is,
Sorry, Salim, into chat afterwards.
I
we've
will
got
find
several
you later.
questions here. Sorry, we've got to limit the amount of questions per person.
Hi, great
Sorry.
work, really interesting. So I was interested, as you have a quite specific, quite good temporal resolution, and I mean stimulus and reaction is one thing, but we know about the succession of processing with auditory and speech. So did you look at some more, not only like stimulus and response, but as the latency of different areas that we know are far, because it was widespread in the prefrontal cortex, where you know there's comes later.
I have in some other studies. I have to admit that this particular study, this particular experiment is suboptimal for that purpose, because basically the participants are instructed to press the button as quickly as they can. So, and that's why basically what I've shown there, the stimulus related and behavior related, those are the extreme cases, because a lot of times things kind of overlap to a degree because it really doesn't take a long time. So it becomes slightly, it's non-trivial to kind of disambiguate those completely.
Yeah, I mean, but you still have looking at this time, basically.
One question.
But it's not the question, it's a clarification. You have the time resolution.
I'll be very glad to continue this. Thank you. That's an excellent point.
Sorry, we're out of time. I'm so sorry. We've got more questions here, out of time. It was a lovely presentation. Come and talk to the presenter afterwards, okay?